right, welcome back, guys. Now we're gonna go over one of my favorite subjects, which is compression. And this is basically using compressors to literally take the audio signal and compress it. That's why they're called a compressor. Pretty straightforward, right? I think that a lot of people make overthink compression a bit too much. In most cases, it's literally just using it to simply compress a signal and level it out a bit more, make it a bit less dynamic, because this is going to also make sure that you can place elements in a mix the way you exactly want them to be, and that there's no weird, say for example in a vocal, there's no weird different hops in the vocal, so that you can hear every word at the same volume that you want to hear it. But of course, you can also do this with volume automation. This is actually a bit more tedious, but often the preferred method because it's more exact and you can still kind of control how natural you want things to sound. But I personally also really love using compression for the characteristics that you can get out of it. So we're going to again start off with the drums, and I'm going to start off by using a glue compressor. So this is an emulation of the SSL compressor, and I'm going to go and walk you through now why I'm setting up a compressor in a certain way and the different possibilities as well, and what all of these knobs do. So as you can see here, you've got attack, release, ratio, threshold, makeup, and then you've got these things here that I'll cover in just a bit. But these are really, in all compressors, this is what you will find, unless you're in the vintage world or analog world, where you get different models which have different setups. But for most VCA compressors, this is what you will find. And the attack basically means the time that the compressor needs to detect the signal and then compress it. So for this compressor, this is anywhere from 0.1 milliseconds to 30 milliseconds. 30 milliseconds being very slow, or, well, not very slow, but as far as this compressor goes, very slow or slow, and this being very, very fast. And for the release is essentially for basically means how long the compression lingers around after it's initially hit. So again, this can be very fast at 0.1 milliseconds, or this is actually, I believe, 0.01 milliseconds, sorry. And this right here is auto, so it automatically adjusts it as it sees fit, or you can go to very long. This is 1.2 seconds. So let me go over what this means, because I don't like thinking about attack and release settings in terms of their actual values. I like thinking of them in 4 different ways, and 4 different setups. So first of all, I only like using in my head the terms slow and fast. I don't think about too many numbers of any sense. I think, okay, slow and fast, and what that means. So fast means that it's going to compress the signal fast. It's going to act fast in the attack section. Fast for release to me means that it's going to release the compression very fast as well. So why is this important? Well, look at it this way. If you've got a transient, say like a kick drum or a snare, passing into a compressor, and you've got it enabled on very, very fast, that compressor is going to clamp onto that signal very, very quickly, which can sometimes lead to the signal choking or just being suppressed. I'll show you what this does right now, actually, as a matter of fact. Let's go ahead and play for these drums, and I'm going to show you the difference between a very fast attack and a very slow attack on something like drums. So you can see this is a pretty extreme example, of course, but you can really tell how fast everything's being leveled out. But with the slower setting, you're basically deciding that you want your transients to pass first, and then it compresses. So this is important because this determines what sound you'll get out of the compressor and what function you'll have as well. And let me go into the dry wet knob here as well for things like parallel compression, which is something a bit more intermediate, but I might as well mention it here. You can basically go ahead and really slam the compressor, so really have a very fast attack and fast release, and really slam the compressor to get a sound, and then mix in that really heavily compressed sound, in this case a very pumping sound, with the original signal. And that's also something which is really, really interesting and something to be covered in different videos as well. But for now, we're just going to stick to the basic principles. So since we're working with drums here, I don't want to choke the kick drum or the snare, so I'm going to choose something which is more of a slow attack. And this is going to be 30 milliseconds or 10 milliseconds, something like that. This also depends to me basically how much of the sound of the compressor I want to have in there. And I also want a relatively fast release. And this basically is most of the time something like my go-to in a sense when I work in EDM, because this works for that type of music. Having a slow attack, a relatively slow attack, and a relatively fast release basically is going to ensure for me that the compression isn't going to be as invasive, but I'm still going to get a characteristic out of it. So let's go ahead and basically play around with some settings here. One thing too is if you really want to learn compression, you can go ahead and set the threshold lower so you can really hear what moving the attack and release is going to do, and then move it up a bit more to where it doesn't sound like you're destroying the sound anymore. And that's actually what we're going to be doing right now. So I like the release very, very fast in this instant. I noticed that when I was placing the release to be somewhere around here, for example, the snare was still being suppressed and the release of the snare didn't really come through as much. So I like the release very, very fast, but I might also want something a bit slower than 30 milliseconds in this scenario, but that's going to be decided in a second for me. Let's go over ratio for a second. So ratio basically determines how much compression is going to be done for every time the threshold detects a signal. So this means that on a 4:1 ratio, there's actually a good explanation of ratio here. That's also one of the great things about Ableton. Always make sure that you're checking out the info view as well. What does it say about ratio? The ratio sets the input and the output level, the knee becomes sharper at higher ratios. Okay, well, that's not really a great explanation, but essentially what you have to think about is that ratio determines for you how much compression is going to be done for every time that the compressor reacts, right? So the higher the ratio, the more compression is going to be done without you having to move the threshold. So say, for example, in a sidechain situation, having a higher ratio is nice because it basically levels the playing field in terms of thresholds. But say in a scenario like mastering, you don't really necessarily want a ratio which is too high unless it's a limiter, because that's going to be too invasive for the signal. And sometimes setting the threshold with a 2:1 ratio acts a bit differently or responds differently than it were to be a 4:1 ratio. So a 4:1 ratio might focus more on transients in a mastering scenario, whereas a 2:1 ratio will just kind of level the playing field a bit and just touch on different sounds in certain different ways. And we're going to just stick to a 4:1 ratio here because that to me sounds best on an SSL type compressor. And let's go ahead, and now that I've explained everything, I can just really go through compressors and set them up in the way that I want them. So we're going to go ahead and get a sound out of the drums with the compressor here. So even though I feel like the kick drum's being choked a bit more with this attack here, I feel like in terms of sitting things together, this is actually sounding better. I'm just going to go ahead and activate this soft clipping here to make sure that when I add a bit more makeup that nothing's going to actually start clipping. And of course, we're adding makeup to make up for the compression that we're doing, because compression reduces volume. So we're going to go ahead and give this a final listen and then before and after to see what we've done here. So you can see here that I had to add a bit more makeup, because to really hear what a compressor is doing, you need to add a bit of gain back in, of course, to make up for the lost volume. And you can really hear how now everything's just starting to groove a bit more, and there's a bit more just glue in between the different instruments. Everything's sitting together a bit nicely. And let's go ahead and see what this does in the context of the rest of the track. So it's subtle, but mixing is a lot of subtle things put together, a lot of subtle and not so subtle things, of course, put together to get a sound out. So we're basically just improving on everything that we're doing here and starting to further just make sure that everything's sitting together nicely, and we're also getting everything grooving. So I like that. What I want to do too is I want to maybe take a look at the mix bus actually. Also, let me go ahead and just reduce this by 0.5 and make a few little gain adjustments here. Just very slight things. And let's actually go ahead and add a glue compressor on the master bus. So here I want to just compress everything together in the same sense that I was using a compressor on the group here. I also want to be using it on the whole track to support that sound. And here I'm also probably going to have something like this. So I'm setting that up in the way that I wanted to. And I'm going to play around with the 2-to-1 setting right now here to see if I prefer that to the 4-to-1 setting and see what sound we can get out of here with that. So I like how that's fairly evenly basically just compressing that whole sound, and it's kind of just giving it a bit more of a vibe. It's just bringing out a bit more of those characteristics, also just beefing up the sound a bit, making everything stick together a lot better. So I like that. And let's also look at one of the other compressors that we have available to us in Ableton, and that's the Multiband Dynamics. This is a multiband compressor. So here we have, similar to what we had in the EQ3, we've got our audio split up in 3 different bands, and all of these different bands are compressing different frequencies or different parts of the frequency spectrum in different ways. So essentially you've got 3 compressors in one, which are all focusing on a different frequency range. And again, the same rules apply here. You've got attack and release. You've got your thresholds here and your ratios. And now, basically, all there is to do is go ahead and select what you want in terms of what you're hearing. So I'm hearing that the high end is starting to get a bit tacky. So I kind of want to make sure that it has a relatively fast attack so it can clamp onto the signal a lot better. I'm also going to be driving in a bit of loudness into all of these just to make sure the compressor reacts in a certain way. I'm also going to just set up the high end a bit higher. Let's take a quick listen to this. So that's perfect. That's exactly tackling the range that I want. Let's listen to the mids. That's nicely capturing all those mids, and listen to the lows. All right, perfect. One thing that I'm also going to do while we're here is I'm going to use this new feature in the utility knob, which is to basically mono frequencies below a certain frequency that you set, which is really nice because you don't want your low end to be in stereo, because this can be very awkward when playing in clubs, and just in general, it's one of those best practices. And also they improved the width knob, so instead of it washing out the mono signal, it actually adds onto its stereo width. So it's true stereo width plugin now. And we're going to go ahead and just start very simply, just do something very, very subtle. This is just going to bring out a bit more of those sides and make everything appear a bit wider. And this is going to help everything be a bit more focused as well with any frequencies that might have not been mono. But that also depends on how you produce. So let's go ahead and set up this multiband compressor. I'm going to go ahead and set this to 30. I'm also going to give this a quicker release at around 5 milliseconds. I'm going to set this to around 25 milliseconds. And 10 is actually fine. Let's actually go ahead and set this to 30 milliseconds, actually. Again, this doesn't make too much of a difference, these little intervals, but I'm just basically throwing numbers out here so I can mess around with them a lot better. So let's listen to this in solo first, band for band, and then do a bit of compression that way. Let's also go ahead and set up these ratios. So I'm wanting to have a 2-to-1 ratio with, there we go, a 2-to-1 ratio. For most of these, I want to have a bit of a higher ratio for the high end though. And let's go ahead and take a listen to this. That's helping gluing everything together, but I don't want all of that effect in there. So I'm just going to set this at 50% to make sure that the original signal isn't affected by that as much as it is now. And that's just, again, helping things leveled out a bit more. So let's go ahead and give all of that a quick listen. just started fixing things up a bit more, and now I'm really happy with the compression. I took that back a bit more, and I also moved this beforehand, so everything is going into this soft clipper essentially, and now everything's sounding good to my ears in terms of the overall compression of certain aspects. And in the next video, I'm going to go over a few other terminologies, a few other things which you should definitely know in terms of the basics of mixing. For one, that would be panning, and also a bit more in depth describing reverbs and ping pong delays and all those different things, and starting to add more things to what we already have in the next videos to make this not only solid mix but also interesting. So stay tuned.